Hello, everyone. My name is Becky Robinson, and I'm so glad to be here today with Jeff DeGraff as we highlight the content of his brand new book, The Creative Mindset. And Jeff, I forgot to ask you before we went live, do you have a copy nearby?
Yes, I do, right here.
I don't have a copy of the book yet. I need to get it. It looks fantastic.
We even did a short run for all of the senior military officials at the Pentagon. And so they have it, and I have one copy.
Got it. Well, I'm glad you have it. So as you're coming into today's webinar, we will be getting started soon, and I want to let you know about a few technical considerations for today's event. You may be able to see that we are recording this session and we are live on Facebook, and so we will make this recording available after today's session. And once we dive into the content, Jeff has a wealth of information on his slides, and we will make those slides available as a PDF to you after today's call in the follow-up email, where you'll also receive the link to the recording. So no need to furiously scribble notes unless you want to and learn better that way. You will get these slides from Jeff, and he's so generous to share them. So Jeff, I love seeing your U of M hat, go blue. We are definitely, a couple of Wolverine fans here today. And Lou's asking the question, are we all on mute? So we are using the Zoom webinar platform, which means that everyone who's watching the webinar is on the other side of a technology wall, and we can't see you or hear you except in chat. So we do want to invite you throughout today's event to please engage with us in the chat. After Jeff shares some basic information and key points from his book, we will be taking some questions from the chat, and Jeff is prepared to answer almost any question about creativity and innovation. I want to see if we can stump the doctor today. He's told me he's really fast on his feet, that he can MacGyver creativity challenges, and I'm going to ignore the Spartans in the chat, and I'm going to showcase David Go Blue, class of '81. I'm the parent of a University of Michigan sophomore. So at any rate, we would love to hear where you're calling in from today. And I often ask you to please take a moment, use the drop-down menu, select all panelists and attendees, and then all of your comments will be seen by everyone on the call and not just Jeff and me. So don't forget to use that drop-down menu so that everyone can see your comments. Welcome to all of you who are telling us where you're calling in from. I saw India. I see almost every state. I see some Purdue fans. I think this is going to become a battle of the universities today. Welcome in London, in Irvine, California. These are going faster than I can read them. So I also want to quickly note before we dive into the content that if you would like to share your thoughts on Twitter or another social platform today, we invite you to use the hashtag #TheCreativeMindset, and that way we'll be able to see all of your comments and insights from today's conversation. So welcome, thank you for being here. Jeff, I'm gonna turn things over to you, and I know you have an introduction because I saw your slides, but I'm just so thrilled to celebrate your book with you.
Thanks, Becky, and thanks for everybody for joining us. I'm broadcasting from my basement. So if you hear a dog bark or you hear a microwave oven going on, you'll know what's going on. I'm imagining you're in the same boat that I am. So let me share some slides with you here. Let me get this up here. Let me pull this way. I want to start with a little bit about who I am and why I did this book. So when I was a very young man, I had the very good fortune of studying with a man named Rudolf Arnheim. And if you know that name, you know it because the entire study of creativity starts at the University of Berlin in about 1900 with a man named Max Wertheimer. And he has two prize students. One is named Kurt Lewin, who creates what we call positive organizational psychology. And the other is Rudolf Arnheim, who really creates what we would now call design thinking. He gives us the term visual thinking, etc. Well, I started my PhD at Michigan when I was very, very young. I was 22. He had a stroke, so I transferred to Wisconsin, and I got involved in something very different. I worked on one of the three first supercomputers in the country, one for the U.S. Weather Service, and trying to get a supercomputer to do what you now see every night on the news with Doppler, and how to actually create some intelligence in that. Well, when I left, I did something that was really quite extraordinary. I turned on an Ivy League position, and I met a guy when I was 25 years old who had a $20 million pizza company, and I decided I wanted to build stuff. So 5 years and $5 billion later, we sold the company to Mitt Romney, and Bain Capital, the company was called Domino's Pizza. So I was one of the original senior executives there. And then from there, I got an offer to come to Michigan by two very famous men, a guy named Robert Quinn and a guy named Kim Cameron. And I remember when they asked me to come to Michigan and teach MBAs to be creative, I remember saying, MBAs are dull, drab, and awful. You can hear them think. And they both laughed and said, yeah, that's why we want you there. So along with Michael Ray at Stanford, I think we were probably the two first kind of people in this field. It did a lot of work around business. There had been earlier people like Alex Osborne and Sid Barnes and some other people. And then finally, probably about 15 or 20 years ago, I had an offer to be the dean at Cambridge University in the UK. And instead, I decided to stay in Ann Arbor, and I got permission if I used my own money, and I teamed up with the Hayworth Company, and I built one of the first innovation networks, what are called collaborative open innovation networks. If you're familiar with WeWork or whatever, a lot of these are based on what we did. It's called the Innovatrium. So when you hear that term, I actually coined the term. So I've been around. I guess that's what I'm trying to tell you. And there's one other thing. I've been in 258 of the Fortune 500 company at the senior level. So I've seen a lot of combat. I'm a 2 million mile guy in Delta. So I want to give you a sense of, I kind of been around. I've seen some stuff. It's like a blues guy, you know. So why would I write a book on creativity? In fact, the first book I wrote in the mid 90s was called Creativity at Work. Why come back? Why do this? Well, I thought there's a lot of stuff out there, and I think there's a lot of stuff out there that's good. But what I wanted to do was to talk about what I've seen really work, what works in actually growing your business or achieving your goal, or even if it's something like making your church a better place or making your family more effective, what actually works. And I really wanted to translate theory into practice, because there are these two parts to creativity. They don't really talk to each other. You know, there's a whole basis of literature, neurobiology, those sorts of things, cognitive psychology, and then there's kind of all these kind of tools. And my big issue, the thing that I really care about, particularly at this point in my life, is the democratization of innovation. I'd like us to get our sense of destiny back, that it's not just about being powerful and rich, it's about making the world a better and new place. And I certainly grew up in a generation where that was part of the aim, and I hope to pass that along to everyone in whatever country you're at, in whatever kind of organization you're in. So the creative mindset, what I wanted to start with was creativity. And I had actually been asked in the 90s by the federal government to give them a definition of innovation. And working backwards to creativity, creativity is just the activity of creating useful novelty, which is all that innovation really is. It's useful novelty. And the more novel it is, the potentially more valuable or more game-changing it is. But what it really means is that most people forget that their basic apparatus of what goes on in their mind is about these neurons firing in a new and unexpected ways, which of course is the basic activity of being creative. And I gave this a term called creativizing, because I want to take kind of the Homeric or grandiose part of creativity out of it. And that is, you know, I think about people in my life who've been the most creative people. I grew up in a HUD house, so I knew a lot of people who didn't have any money, including us. And, you know, my mother and father were amazing at what they could do with things. So creativizing is just taking the ordinary and making something extraordinary out of it. And that's what I really want this book to be about, how everybody can do this, how, you know, we should be teaching this to our young people, how if you've got a startup, you could be doing this. And I call the people who do this we're creativizers. So we creativize, we're creativizing, it's sort of like Martinizing or winterizing, and we're creativizers. So in the chat, I'd like to know what puts you in a creative mindset. You know, is it music? Is it the sun coming up? Is it your best friend? Is it a glass of wine? What is it? So we should talk about that later, because there's quite a bit of data on what does that really tell us about how people create. Now,
would you like to hear some of those now, Jeff? I'm
sure.
seeing some.
Sure.
Let's see, music and nature, curiosity, exercising, travel and nature, listening to music and being around open water, music, reading, nature, praying, thinking. Um, Kitty says it's her 60 to 90-minute morning walk, wine, a difficult challenge, nature, water waves, hiking, free time, quiet. I don't know if I want to read this one. Sitting on the toilet, really? Thank you, John, for your,
Or the
frankness.
shower.
Meditation, music and rain, alone time, another music, conversation, the shower.
Well, let me
Um,
stop you there and give you a couple things. So one of the things that you really have to be aware of, it's not creativity on demand. One of the things we know, it's creativity when creativity demands it, when you have what's called a flow state. Now, some people have flow states when they're relaxed. That's meditation before you go to sleep, petting the dog, all right, when your mind calms down, right? This is sort of in the meditation process, we're trying to empty the chatter in your mind, right? But some people are creative when they're stimulated, when they're moving around. I'm that guy. My students, if they want to have office hours, have to go on an afternoon constitutional with the old professor, right? And they can't, and I'm a former, athlete, so we got to keep up. So I'm a stimulate guy, let's talk to people, let's draw. So pay attention. Are you a more empty and sort of relaxed, empty the mind, relax, or more kind of create some chatter for yourself? And also pay attention to when that rhythm happens. Is music playing? Is it quiet? Is it the morning? Is it the evening? And this is going to have a lot to do with this. And incidentally, Becky, I'm a terrible hypocrite, because I write a lot of, I think I'm over 500 articles at this point in my career. And I always say when I'm on an airplane, and I'm always on an airplane, I'm going to write the next article on the airplane. After all these years, I still can't write on airplanes. And I still tell myself I'm going to write on airplanes, which is silly, right? Because I can't. What I do on airplanes is I daydream and think about stuff and make notes. And then when I get to the hotel room or whatever, then I can write. So you've all had this experience. It's just you can't turn it on and off like it's a faucet, right? And there's a lot of books that say you can, but there's a lot of research that says you can't. So let's talk about that mindset. So a creative mindset has a lot to do with the way you think about the world. And if you're familiar with any of my work, you're familiar with the competing values framework and the innovation code and dominant logic and all those kinds of things. This book doesn't really deal with this. This book is basically taking a lot of research that's come up over the years from people you've probably never heard of, like E. Paul Torrance, or Griffith, or Alex Osborne, or even the behaviorist Watson, who created this company people forget called J. Walter Thompson, which is the great advertising company. So the early work has led to a lot of modern science, and a lot of the modern science has really turned towards neurobiology. I'm not going to spend too much time on that today, but I've translated this into sort of layman's terms. So first of all, notice where, when, and how you're creative. That's the question we just asked. When and what's your creative spot? I built the first Innovatorium 20 years ago with Hayworth, basically to create a place where people could come together simply to create things. So that's kind of how that idea got started. Be prepared at all times to capture ideas when they begin to flow. So I'm an old guy, and I use this thing I keep in my pocket, but I notice some people like to use their phone, and some people like to, keep a pad and a pen by their bed. But you know that when the ideas begin to flow, you have to capture them, because if you try and go back and get them, you can never reconstitute them. Pay attention to who and what gives you energy. There are people that can call me at 2 in the morning. I have a good friend in India, and if he calls me 2 in the morning, we'll talk to 4 in the morning. And even if I'm exhausted, because he's energizing. And there's also people in my life, I might want to say, and you might have them too, who when they stop by my office, just take all the energy out of me. So obviously one of the things you want to pay attention to is who gives you creative energy and who takes you creative energy. It's not really a lot written about that in a business school book, is there? I call this next one, consult the muses in your mind. Maybe some of the listeners out there have this. I don't want to get into cognitive psychology, but your mind is capable of doing limited parallel processing, not a lot of it, but limited. And one of the things that happens to me when I'm working on something is I'll hear a song in the back of my mind, like a soundtrack. And usually I ignore it, but when I pay attention to it, it's usually really relevant. It's telling me something that for some reason I don't have in front of me, right? And these are what I call the muses in your mind. You see something and it reminds you of something. You make a synaptic connection, right? The whole idea that your brain is constantly looking for things to connect to, either to make the familiar unfamiliar, or the familiar or the unfamiliar familiar, right? Your brain is assimilating and accommodating information. Look for signs and incongruities and anomalies. This is one of my favorite things right now. So I was just at a big briefing with a lot of very senior military people in Washington. And one of the things I was talking about was this anomaly that I thought everybody had overlooked. And that is, in the same way that most governments, particularly our government, has really kind of, blown the play when it comes to the virus. That didn't work. What people haven't noticed is that something else emerged, and that was these loose federations, sometimes called creativity clusters, these loose federations of, Oxford and AstraZeneca, and Harvard and Moderna, and Michigan and Pfizer, and Imperial College and Johnson & Johnson, and hundreds of startups and fintech. They've emerged. And what's happened is the amount of time it's taken to discover or to do drug discovery on a vaccine, which is usually 5 to 8.5 years, is going to be contracted, not to a year, because by the time it's a more perfected vaccine, let's say 2 years, but it's cutting the time to a third. So the anomaly is, while one system failed, another system emerged. And why that's important is drug discovery will never be the same after this. Neither will education, right? The cost of education, et cetera. You can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? Pay attention to things that don't fit. That's your creative mind talking to you. Challenge boundaries and authority. One of the big things about creativity is part of the reason that people squash creativity is creativity creates deviance. I want to repeat that. Creativity creates useful deviance. And what happens is systems are designed to maintain themselves. So organizations are not designed to create. If you think about the organizations that really create, they create in a couple of times. They create when they're startups, and the reason they create when they're startups, they can't compete on scope or scale, and they create when they're in a crisis. Like right now, you're starting to see a lot of organizations do things. Think of a bell curve. The reason innovation happens at the edges of the bell curve, the risk of trying something radical and the reward of staying where you're at is reversed. The same is true if your uncle's an alcoholic or whatever, right? So creativity and innovation have lower barriers to entry when you're at the edges of the bell curve, crisis or exceptional. The middle of the bell curve is designed to get rid of deviance. So don't start in the middle, right? That's the last book I wrote. That's the innovation code. Escape assumptions about how things should be. Everybody believes that once we get a vaccine, everything's going to go back to the way it was. It's not. Right? And that's a bunch of assumptions. So you might want to start thinking about, how is it going to be? And most importantly, have a sense of destiny. Creativity really requires a certain level of stick-to-itiveness. You got to kind of really hang in there. And I always tell people, if you got a great idea, it's going to cost you 3 times as much money, take you 3 times, three times as much time as you think it is. And creativity is not about throwing a good punch. It's about taking a good punch. You really have to stick with it to make it work. So that's the mindset we want people in. So making it up as you go along is kind of a key thing. And I'm a big believer in see one, do one, teach one. The way we learn to be creative is the same way that Chaldean crows learn to use compound tools, right? And octopi and dolphins and everything else. We see it, and then we try it. And one of the ways I did that was in the building of Domino's Pizza. You couldn't have bought a pizza store when it was the fastest growing company in America. You had to be a manager in training, and you had to be apprenticed, right? And we developed a thing called the team member workbench. And if you ever go back and look at what it was, it will look alarmingly like Facebook to you. And then it will occur to you that this is 20 years before Facebook. Mobile satellites, one of the first mobile satellite networks, of course, which became eventually part of the ESPN network. Well, we made pizza, we made the commissaries with robotics. And so the whole idea of how Domino's got built was, at every turn, we had a problem because we weren't big enough to compete with PepsiCo and Pizza Hut and McDonald's and everybody else. So we had to kind of make stuff up as we go along. And that's kind of what creative people do. Remember Steve Jobs in his famous Stanford address said the creative people always feel guilty because they saw something in one place and they simply applied it to another. I think it's a great quote. So here's another question for you. When were you the most creative? What was it? When you were in a crisis, the divorce, when you were 10? When did you get this creativity bug?
So Lou says that he thinks most people in most fields are making things up as they go along most of the time. Deepak says when at peace, he's the most creative. When I had the freedom to innovate, An emergent need that demanded a response came up. When I'm less focused on myself and more on the world, Nancy says when younger. Ursel says in times of life transition. Barbara says, I've been the most creative when COVID started. Under stress, Kitty said when she had 3 kids under 5 years old.
Poor
That will
kid.
definitely cause you to be creative.
That's the
When there's a problem to solve, when I designed systems first by looking at the end goals 5 years in the future, being reflective, pressure, when I'm idle, when I bought a business and had to pivot quickly. More people saying when they're faced with a challenge or stress, in crisis,
So
when
let's
there's
stop there
freedom.
for a minute. So let's
Mhm.
stop. What everyone has in common is that that neural net still exists. That creative pathway still exists in your mind. And you know that because you were creative when you were young, and when forced, necessity is the mother of invention. When forced to be creative, you were creative again. And that's to me what's wonderful. I know it's I don't mean to sound like I'm overly optimistic, but the wonderful thing about recessions is that we have to find workarounds, and we do. That sometimes there's a failure involved, but remember, all learning is developmental. The failure cycle cannot be avoided. It can only be accelerated. That's how venture capitalists, why they invest in a round, and they're trying to turn the portfolio. But if you don't believe that all learning is developmental, take a piece of paper out and draw a picture of your spouse or your dog, and everybody on this chat can tell you at what age you stopped learning to draw. Speak a foreign language, play an instrument. It doesn't matter whether you're 8 or 80, right? The notion is you have to go through that cycle, but the good news is it's still there. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on what's in the book, but I am going to lay out kind of how we pick the 6 skills. Now, these are not just a bunch of tools. What I originally did with the book was I originally built a pyramid, a cognitive pyramid, and said there's kind of a cognitive steps to this. And my publisher said, no one will read that book. They don't want to know about all the research and how your brain is working. What they want to know is what's going to make their life more valuable. So what I did was I created a mnemonic device called Create with my wife, Stanny. Remember, this is a co-authored book. And we've given each one a name that corresponds with the letter. So the first one is clarify, and it's kind of it's the weird one. I originally wanted to call it concentrate because it rhymed with the others, but the publisher didn't like that. And I'm going to talk about why that's important. I trained McKinsey consultants for years in New York, and one of the problems is really smart people have a tendency to start solving problems before they really know what the problem is, right? So this is going to be an enormous issue and probably the most important issue in creative thinking. Do you really understand what's going on here, right? And particularly the smarter you are, the more difficult it is. So this, all the Dunning-Kruger stuff isn't just for people who aren't self-aware. It's also for people who are very bright and not self-aware of what other people have to go through. Replicate. Mimicking, just simply copying the secrets of nature. This is where biomimicry comes in the geodesic dome at Disney World. Elaborate, which is multiplying ideas. Sometimes this is called bisociative. And this is where brainstorming comes in and things that are more advanced than brainstorming. Associate, which is my favorite. And this is connecting ideas with analogies. And some people are analogical thinkers. They're more pattern seekers. And I fit in that category where you can say, how do things go together, or what's missing here in this picture? Translate, which is one of the hardest creative capabilities people have. And it really comes down to, can you tell a story about it? And again, Steve Jobs was great at this, and we see some people are tremendous at telling stories. And if you don't believe this is hard, watch a small child try and tell a story, or watch your Aunt Ruth try and tell a dirty joke, right? It's hard to do, right? There's a lot of things that have to work. And then finally, evaluate. How do you know what the best ideas are? And what I find a lot of times in my own work, it's not that people are overly ambitious, trying to boil the ocean and extract gold. The problem is that a lot of times they leave the billion-dollar idea on the board, right? More often than not. And how do you actually pick that? So the book gets into all these tools. So I'm just going to give you a smattering of this. So I'm going to kind of hustle through this, right? Because I want to make sure I take time for your questions. So clarify is the first one. So I decided to give you an example. So one of the things I'm very concerned about is with COVID-19, there are about 487 small colleges in the United States that are in jeopardy of folding because they can't keep their doors open. They don't have large endowments. And these are really important institutions, right? There might be one in your community. So I lay out here what their challenge is. Due to COVID-19, small colleges our small college will need to develop a plan to go virtual for at least next year. Well, that doesn't really tell us what the problem is. What the problem really is due to COVID-19, small college will lose 15% of its current enrolled students. It must develop a plan to operate virtually for the next year with only 80% of its current budget. That's what the real issue is, right? So the issue at the beginning sounds like it's an issue of scheduling. It's an issue of sort of what has to happen in a time-based thing, but really it turns out it's an issue of money. How do we get the money to do this? And then I ask a bunch of questions about this, clarify your project and clarify your involvement. So what exactly is important about the project? Well, we know that we have to radically change how the college operates. Is it real? These are what I call the 3M questions. They come from Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, the famous 3M company. Is it real? Yes, it's real. We don't have the money. Why am I working on this? Because I care about this, right? I'm an administrator at this college. Is it worth doing? Well, of course it is. We want to keep the college open. What do I hope to accomplish by gain a resolve? I hope to give the students a first-class education during this. Can I really succeed? And this is where you have to be honest. You know, I'm unsure. Because a lot of times in my work, the answer is no. And if I don't believe I can succeed, I have to reframe the project, right? Because I want to succeed. And remember, most creative endeavors don't. So you have to be willing to do version 1, version 2, version 3. Nobody likes to hear that. They want to take a pill and lose 50 pounds, right? It doesn't work that way. Will the project make a difference? So on and so forth. These are questions. And questions are important when you're clarifying because they take you somewhere. And then finally, the most important piece about this is you want to look at information. It's not just data. You also want to talk to people. I'm always amazed when I have my MBA students they do a very big project. They're doing one right now. And my big thing is I won't take secondary sources. I make them call. And it's a really funny thing that we have a generation that, you know, does everything online, but they're kind of really nervous about calling somebody. You saw this person was working on this. You saw it on a blog or somewhere. Pick up the phone and call them and talk to them. What do we actually know about that? And this is important because we live in a world where people believe they know everything. How many of your social media friends all of a sudden are experts at virology and what should be done with the virus? And you sat next to them in your biology class and they couldn't even pass biology, and now they're telling you about the virus. I've been an advisor for years, the Federal Reserve. I wouldn't dare tell you about monetary policy because I sit next to a Nobel Prize winner, right? The notion is know who knows. And so rather than spending all your time gaining information, talk to somebody. And it's not just about education. You want to know about raising a child? Talk to a woman who's got 5 kids, right? I want to know about, you know, how you're going to start your business? Talk to a guy who's on his, he's on his 3rd restaurant, right? Talk to somebody who actually knows. Now, the next is replicate. And I'm not going to spend time on this, but this can be very sophisticated. It can be something as challenging as biomimicry. And biomimicry is how we make, you know, that the wings on the F-35 or the, you know, the flukes on a nuclear submarine look like a whale, and so on and so forth. These are all very common things. You know, Velcro came from, you know, a Swedish engineer who had burrs who stuck to when he went out hiking in the field, right? So, and in the book gets into all of these, there's methods for these skills. But the key is to think about the skill and where the method goes. And why this is important is skills are not interchangeable. They're like tools in a toolkit. A hammer, a wrench, a saw, and a screwdriver, they're not interchangeable, but they're really all important, but you use them differently and in different situations. So this book delineates that. Elaborate, which is brainstorming on steroids. There's all kinds of things your brain naturally does in making synaptic connections, and it really focuses on how do we get them to do that. Now, I want to talk about this whole idea of reconstructing to deconstructing to reconstructing. One of the things that I worked on years ago was a project called C2, which you know is Coke Zero. It was a really great marketing organization. Coca-Cola is amazing, right? But the notion was they very rarely have a project fail. And it was in, I don't know if you know this, the first aluminum bottle actually was a joint project with Alcoa and Coca-Cola. So if you buy your beer in an aluminum bottle, you can thank Coca-Cola. And the new sweetener, Trivial, and all that came from there, and the clever name and all that stuff. But all we did was move the project across the street because people don't like to go across the street because their pointy hat doesn't really mean very much. And we took the product apart, put it in a plastic bottle, put more caffeine in it. Maybe you're not supposed to know that. Went back to NutraSweet, and gave it a test name called Coke Zero. So sometimes it's just as simple as taking something apart to its features and attributes, right? And putting it back together in a new way. This is what the fashion industry does all the time, right? This year's fashion is basically the same fashion repurposed with a different spin on it from 15, 20 years ago. My favorite, associate, connecting ideas with analogies. So I want to talk about this one for just a minute, if you'll allow me, if you'll indulge me. Adaptive reasoning is just how you take an idea and it's in relationship to another idea. It's how these concepts basically go together or don't. And in fact, in art, one of the things that people often do is they'll try and fool you by putting two things together that don't usually go together. This is called defamiliarization. They're trying to confuse you. They're trying to get you to make a new connection. So when we get complex ideas, we try and say, how is X like Y? You know, how is this new soft drink like jumping into a swimming pool on a hot day? Oh, it's refreshing. See, we make that connection. And we all do that in shorthand. And that's what advertisers do to us all the time. Adaptive reasoning is a way of clustering a lot of ideas that normally don't go together. So when you have a brainstorming session, you might have 20 or 30 ideas, but they're just a checklist of ideas. And most of the time, those ideas aren't very valuable because there's no real solution. There's nothing that holds them together, right? There's no way for us to understand how these go together. So we end up you know, with a whole bunch of pieces that don't, puzzle pieces that don't go together. When we use analogies and metaphors, it's very important to note that analogies, for the most part, are cultural. So if I talk about baseball and I'm in Indonesia, which is where Stanny's from, my wife, the co-author, it's probably not going to go very well because they don't play baseball. The only metaphors that really work, or analogies that work, are things like birth and death and love and things that everybody on this planet experiences. And of course, with everything that we do, we make connections all the time. Our brain is always doing this. So let's go back to our small college. A small college, we're trying to think of a way, a new way of teaching. And we have a list of kind of a random list here, which I simply pressed a button on a computer to get a random list here. And we came up with a whole bunch of stuff. And we looked at language and beehive and genome. And we looked at solar system. And somehow solar system was the one that we thought we might be able to build an analogy out of. So we start out with saying, what's the problem at the college? Remember, we go back to our clarify. Safety of our students, money, delivery, you know, how the students feel, the faculty, our parents, you know, do they want to send their kids? The buildings, are they even safe? The information technology, can it support online learning? The materials that the students need to have. And then we compare that to a bunch of words that we generate when we think about our analogy of a solar system. Earth and gravity and space and meteors and dark matter and all this other stuff. And what happens is we start to find a metaphor that emerges. And the metaphor that emerges is we liked the idea of stars and gravity. And somebody in our group says, you know, one of the things that happens with stars and gravity is sometimes two stars trade planets. They're called binary stars. I learned that when I was a freshman in, you know, whatever college you went to. And you say, okay, now what would we do with this idea, this metaphor of trading planets? Well, could we have a horizontal network where maybe there's 10 small colleges in a region, and each college can rotate, you know, during COVID, a part of the semester. We put them all on a bus and send them to the next place and clean up the last place. We could do some peer-to-peer stuff. So the notion is, you know, we can't afford all the professors right now, so we have to furlough some. And so half the professors are going to teach a course, but they're going to teach it at all 10 universities in this thing online. We could have a federation of users and producers, so the students could be doing something here that actually becomes part of the curriculum. We could use hotel rooms that are vacant and create small learning pods. We could have an integrated business model, so we no longer operated simply as a small college. We might also have part of a federation online, like we did here at Michigan with Coursera, which we did with Stanford and Princeton at the beginning, and so on and so forth. So there's a number of things we could do. And why that's important is when you start listening to college presidents, don't you sort of scratch your head and go, that's all you came up with? You came up with that? There was so much more we could have done, and all we did was scratch the surface on this whole idea of analogy around binary stars. Translating is, of course, telling a story about something. And that's a pretty doggone hard thing to do. One of my favorite stories around this that people don't know, I worked on something called AppleNet in the early 1980s. Apple could not compete with Microsoft. There was way more software on Microsoft. And this is during during a period of time where Apple calls this AIS, Applied Integrated Systems. So I go way back with the Apple people. And it's kind of a cult community, if you think about the Apple people and their value-added resellers. And what we did was we basically put all the code out for the Apple product, which they would never do that now. And we invited in venture capitalists. This is how Kleiner Perkins and all those famous people got involved. And horizontally or peer-to-peer, they began to develop software. Sound familiar? Yeah, this is the model for iTunes, and it's the model for how the whole Apple universe ecosystem got built. And if you look into this, there's something called Apple Knowledge Navigator, which was shown in 1987, I think. This is when Scully's now in there, and I'm an advisor at the time. But what's really funny is when you watch it, and this is where my young people don't get this, this is 25 years before we have iPods and all this other stuff, right? So the notion is, even early on, we're beginning to see if we change the story about how we're going to produce stuff, we can actually produce different stuff. And of course, it didn't work at first, and jobs got pushed out, and this was a pretty traumatic time. But of course, in the end, it did. And that's part of stories. You got to tell it over and over and over till it makes sense. And then finally, got to evaluate these things, right? And there's a number of tools in there for evaluation, tools that I've seen particularly work. And then under each of these, there are a number of kind of simple step-by-step how to do it. And in each one, there's a let's do one together. So, you know, for each one, let me show you how to do this with your people. So it's the idea, it's pretty turnkey, but there's actually more to that. And I'm going to show you that in a minute. But I'd also love to know in the chat, what's your most important skill to you? Is it clarifying? Is it replicating, elaborating, associating, translating, evaluating? For you, what is the most important skill? What's the one that you really gravitate to?
So I see a few coming in, 2 clarifies and an elaborate, another clarify, associate, translate. It looks like it's all over the place. The only one that I'm not seeing, which surprises me, Jeff, is evaluate. There's one. In my mind, that one is the trickiest. How do you know which one is the best idea? But it looks like...
You know why? There's no data on the future. And the big problem that people have is they get stuck in the planning cycle. Have you been to the meeting about the meeting? Have you seen the report about the report? No, you're not doing stuff. Why I love that we're all over the board. Almost all these activities happen in a different part of your brain. They're different skills. They're not the same skill. And so when people talk about, are they creative? My big thing is, well, what do you mean by that? Right? Because people are like superheroes. They have super skills in some areas and a terrible flaw. We all do. That's why we need other people. Otherwise, we wouldn't need them, right? So the notion is, it's not about being great at something you're not naturally great at. It's about finding what you're great at and finding other people who are great at the other things that you need. That's what this is about, right? And incidentally, that's a very important thing. And anybody who's followed any of my research work or any of my previous publications, you'll know that I'm very big on the notion of diversity because it produces the creative power of constructive conflict. It's part of the reason that America has been so successful in innovation for so long. And now we're starting to see it in other countries. India, for example, parts of Korea, right? Africa, Ghana, what's happening in Ghana. Where we find diversity, we're also going to find points of departure, and we're going to find amazing kind of outputs of that. So you don't have to live in one of these places. You just have to surround yourself with people who are different. So let's start applying your creative mindset, and let's start making innovation happen. Because your greatest work of art, your greatest creation is yourself. Now, not just the book. One of the things we're going to do is we're going to send you an email, because the book comes with a whole series of tools, right? And these are giveaways. So there's an assessment. Those who are familiar with the innovation assessment we developed, which is the largest in the world, right? There's a creativity assessment that goes with the book. And it's simple, online, anybody can do it. There are 15 videos, so you don't have to explain all this stuff. You can watch the old professor take everybody through, let's do one together, right? So you could put it into, you could do a class around this. There are worksheets, there's a whole bunch of worksheets, and there's a couple hundred slides that go with this, and all of this is available, right? So we're going to put it on a landing page, because remember, my big thing is the democratization of innovation. What I really want is I really want school teachers and people who have startup businesses. I want people to get back into the rhythm of making things better and new. I think that's a very important thing for all of us worldwide. I think it's gonna connect us again. You can buy the book on Amazon, I think starting in a week or two. I think in a couple of weeks here. Becky will give you more details on that. Becky, I'm going to wrap it up. I went about 10 minutes longer than I planned, and I want to make sure I got time for questions, comments, pushback. Who wants to take a shot at the old man?
Yes, and I would welcome your questions in the chat, and I'll share those with Jeff. And I have one to get us started. You mentioned earlier in the call when you were asking people to describe the conditions during which they are most creative. And you said that some people are most creative when they're active and others are more creative when they're still. Do you find that there are any people who cross both?
Yeah, I think a lot of people do. But I think it's like being right-handed or left-handed. The issue isn't about what you want to be. The issue is where did you find it? You know, where did you find your creativity? So I'll give you a good example. When I start to, one of your respondents said this, when I start to write, I'll sit in my, I have this very interesting rhythm of my life. I'm either on a stage or I'm lock the door and play classical music. That's part of my process. But what happens is I always get to this process where I just don't know where I'm going and I don't know how it all fits together. And so one of the things I do, which I'm almost predictable, you could put a stopwatch on me. At the Ross School of Business, you'll find me downstairs at the gym. And I run on a treadmill really hard for about 40 minutes, right? Till I'm just exhausted. And for some reason, and then this, again, I probably shouldn't be saying this, I have a pull-out thing that people don't know it's a pull-out thing, and I take a 20-minute nap. So I run hard, take a 20-minute nap, and when I get up, all of a sudden it all makes sense to me. Now, I don't know why that is, and it's both stimulating and relaxing. I don't know what it is, but I guarantee you everybody on here has one of these. Everybody on here knows there's a thing they do, and they're ashamed to tell anybody because it seems so odd, right? It's not odd. You're a human being, right? And what I'm saying is pay attention to that because that's where the gold is. And so, when I'm unsuccessful, I try and write on planes. I try and push through to the afternoon, and then I look at the stuff a couple days later and I go, "This is terrible."
Okay. Well, tons of questions coming in, so we'll get to as many of these as we can. Dennis is wondering, how important is intuition in your understanding of creativity?
It's very important. I didn't add this to the book, and I'm going to tell you why. When you get into higher mind functions, you start stepping on toes around science and religion. Because when you start thinking about intuitions, where that intuition comes, who sent you the message, right? That becomes a very loaded thing. I'm not saying that's not important. In fact, it's the highest level, and it's very important. Highly creative people have what's called cognitive mobility, a lot of cognitive mobility. Now, we know Richard Sperry won the Nobel Prize, right, in, what was it, 83 for brain dominance theory. We know that's not exactly right, but it's generally right that your neurons fire in patterns. They don't fire in the way that we thought they did, but they fire in patterns. And one of the interesting things is that neuron patterns that fire in ways that are not normally, that are not the most well-traveled grooves, which might be what you'd call intuition, is a very common feature of what we would call high-functioning creative people. Incidentally, you should know this. The other people who are high-functioning in creativity, other than children, because remember, their neural nets haven't been formed yet, and we have neural nets to create shorthand so we can process the world. Otherwise, it's too complicated. I'm not encouraging this. People have dementia. People have dementia. There's a test for it. I don't like the test, so I'm not going to tell you what the test is called because I think it's not an accurate test. But there's a test that they use, and people who begin to see the erosion of their neural net, their synaptic connections, have a tendency to be high-functioning creative people. So yes, intuition plays a very strong role. In this book, am I really getting my arms around that? No, I'm not. I didn't intentionally, because I think that takes us into areas where people they either dismiss it as new age thinking or religious stuff, or they want to get into brain neurobiology, which I don't think is helpful.
Got it. Okay. So Mark mentions that too often kids stifle their creative ideas for fear of standing out. How can we best support them in letting their creativity out?
Yeah, whenever somebody says something that's creative, it's a very intimate moment. And as a parent, I think the best thing you can say is, that's interesting. Let's try it. That's interesting. And the same thing as a leader, because even if it's wrong, they'll course correct. You know, that's what learning is about. The more you micromanage, and I'm very worried about this generation. I think we've micromanaged them to death. You know, so by the time I get them, they're senior, you know, their capstone course at Michigan or their MBAs. The first time you say there's not an answer and there's not one problem, you have to find it. And they'll try stuff and they look to see, you know, am I going to get because we grade on a curve at Michigan, right? It's a pretty competitive place. Do I get an A or do I get and I don't respond that way. I'm like, that's not what we're trying to do. That's interesting. What did you learn? Tell me about what did you learn about that? And I think as a parent, that's the best way to grow up. Yeah, I have my mother and father are very different. My mother is a don't do that person. My father's a hurt, didn't it guy? Hurt, didn't it? I mean, right? Rub dirt on it. I'm from the rub dirt on it generation, right? Which parent, you know, the only time you don't say, you know, hurt, didn't it, is juniors playing in the middle of the freeway. Then you get them. But for the most part, we don't need to micromanage people. And I think creativity is such a sacred thing. It's such a personal thing. We need to just encourage that. And the only thing we can do, we can't change the rules. We can just model that behavior.
Sure. So David is wondering, how does emotional intelligence or EQ aid in having a creative mindset?
The wires get crossed on this a lot. And if you know anything about my work, you know, I'm also closely associated with the positive organizational scholarship movement, right? Which has a lot to do with emotional intelligence, giving positive reinforcement for things. I would say that creativity has to have an affirmative sense of judgment. But there's a difference between creating the idea and selling the idea. Selling the idea or having an empathetic understanding of the person you're selling it to does take emotional intelligence. But I put it to you this way: super creative people like Nikola Tesla were alienating to people, and knew Steve Jobs very well. He wasn't particularly easy to get along with, right? So I can go down this list with you. The notion is emotional intelligence has a role, but there's not a one correlation. And I might even add, neither is cognitive intelligence. There seems to be a very low threshold of how intelligent you have to be to make something better or new, right? And we do this by looking at patents, et cetera. So it's not about being a genius.
Thanks. Patricia says, the cultural norms in our society are not necessarily tolerant to contrarian thinking and intellectual friction. I'm curious about your thoughts on how to communicate more effectively in these circumstances.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's at the center of a lot of my work. You know, one of the things I always talk about are the 21 places in America that produce almost all the intellectual property. I happen to live in one. I live in a small town called Ann Arbor. It depends on what year it is. You know, it's only 100,000 people, but on a per capita basis, we typically have the most venture capital per person in the country, right? How do you do that? Well, one, you surround yourself with people who are not like you. Two, you make differences normative. Now, let me dig here a little bit, because this gets a little political. I think the big thing is in social media, we microsegment you. So all the people who like you are not very helpful. They just believe all the same nonsense you believe. And this leads to Dunning-Kruger. It leads to why we're getting fed this stuff from these troll farms, which we're going through right now in the election. It writes a whole series of things. You never see the loyal opposition. And so you demonize them. So the big thing, I think, is to surround yourself with people who aren't like you. Engage in the conflict in a ideation way, not personal. So the notion is this is not a personal issue. We're going to talk about the idea. And I'm afraid even in colleges, we've taken that away from people. We say these are safe spaces and trigger words. Well, don't get me wrong. If it's running somebody down or a prejudicial thing or a racial thing, of course you don't want that. But if it's an idea that you don't particularly like, well, we have to have a discussion around this. So we have to engage, if this makes sense to you. We're looking for disconfirming feedback. That's a sure sign of an elegant mind. One of the things I think that I've been pretty successful at in my career is I love the famous saying by Bertrand Russell: the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are so certain of themselves and wiser people so full of doubts. I think that's so true. So I think the modeling is be full of doubts about your own ideas so that you're open. And then here comes the final part. And it comes back to sort of a thing that at least the cultural tradition I come from has. grandparents were immigrants. I'm married to an immigrant, so I come from that kind of immigrant culture. But if you have a shared sense of, if you have a shared vision, differences can come together. So I got to give the TED Talk when the Affordable Care Act was rolled out at the White House. I got to do it at the Kennedy Center with Scott Collins and Mike Porter and everybody else. It was a lot of fun. But one of the fun things about that is when you listen to the whole debate about healthcare, this is a great example of this. One side says it should all be nationalized, right? The other side sort of stuck in romantic individualism. We should all have our choices. Well, those are the goal line. And those are the sidelines. Those are not the real options. So we're spending all of our time yelling at each other, and I would say we're not engaging. So you can be the model that takes a higher point of view and tries to engage in an interesting way. Now, don't get me wrong, at the edges of the bell curve, right now, probably not a good time, but there's a lot of room in the middle of that bell curve where we could be having a lot of good conversations.
Yeah, that's really powerful and helpful, Jeff. Thank you. Prasad is wondering how spontaneous creativity differs from structured creativity.
That's a really good question, and it has to do with two things. The advantage of spontaneous creativity is you're going to make synaptic connections. You're going to see things that you normally didn't see, and you're going to have a lot of energy around it. And a lot of times this happens at the two extremes of creativity, the ideation phase and the operational phase, where you're trying to work something out. Methodical or process creativity or institutional creativity is very useful in taking ideas and getting them built. So let me give an example. I just was at a venture capitalist recently, and they talked about, you know, how they had funded these projects and for, you know, X amount of millions of dollars, but actually when it came out to building the projects, it was far more expensive than they thought because they didn't consider what's called the aft position or the scale position in the designing of it. And this is so for the record, you know, I'm Rudolph Arnheim's last graduate student, so the founder of design thinking, this is my big problem with most of what I see in design thinking. It's one thing to make something in a proof of concept. It's an entire other thing to make 3 million versions of that vaccine or 300 million versions of that vaccine. You know, you go from, you know, I've made a connection of how I'm going to, you know, how I'm going to put this on a, you know, on top of a virus that currently exists versus are there enough glass vials and, you know, is there enough Walgreens drive-through in order to get people to do this? So programmatic creativity is very important, particularly in the aft end of this, whereas I think spontaneous creativity is more important at the beginning, typically.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Jenna is wondering what kind of metrics you can apply to innovation and creativity.
It's a great question. In my previous book, The Innovation Code, I start to intimate this, and some of you know a lot of my work is used on Wall Street, but the top of the model, what I'm going to call radical creativity and collaborative creativity, are what are called convex forms of value. And the problem with convex forms of value is they happen in the future for which we have no data now, right? What's the coffee, you know, the famous Kierkegaard saying, you know, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forward, something to that extent. So the problem with creativity is we can measure the things that are likely to enable creativity. Diversity, the yield of ideas, relative differentiation of ideas, right? And there's a number of cognitive tests. We have a colleague, Dr. Lee at William & Mary, does a lot of work on this. She's very, very bright. I look at her work. When it comes to actually looking at the outcome, not so easy. And the way that we did this is we didn't look at creativity, we looked at innovation because that is the tangible outcome. And remember, I am a business school professor and that's what they pay me to do, right? To look at how that grows. And the only way to do that is to create associated proxies to say that typically, I don't want to get too technical here because it's what's called stress testing, but typically this outcome is preceded by this kind of thing. So the only way to really do that is to look for the attribute that is a red flag that you're going to get the outcome. And these are called related metrics. Outcome metrics can only happen if you can actually measure the outcome that's happening now. Because creativity creates innovation, which pays in the future, this convex form of value. And incidentally, when you figure that out and do that, I hope you invite me to your Nobel speech in Stockholm, because it is the great problem of economics.
Okay, Jenna, so there's a challenge that Jeff has thrown down for you. Let's see. So John says, since we all have a terrible flaw and need others with skill in our weak area, how do you get engagement and ideas from those who think that they don't know anything about the problem?
Oh, wow. I actually think that's, I love to go to two groups of people when I start working on a problem. The first one is I love to go to people that are domain experts. And for a couple hours, I just, I take notes and I listen carefully. And the second is I love to go to people who know nothing about the field. And I love to just ask them questions and they ask me questions back, which tells me half the time that I haven't framed the problem right. So I'll give you an example of this. I was working for a very large pharmaceutical company, and they were talking about a drug that they were developing for a particular condition that people get. And well, let me give a better. I actually got a better one. Let me give you a better one. So I got Stanny, my wife got an award for building this big innovation network at Michigan. Seekers and solvers, connect, match.com. This goes back 15, 20 years. Connect like match.com without all the, without all the swipe left or right. I forget what they do. So we're sitting in a restaurant in Ann Arbor, and I'm explaining how we built this very technical system, and we're very smart. And this old guy sitting across from us, who's a chemistry professor, goes, "I don't get it, because why would I want to do that?" And the more I tried to explain it to him, he's like, "I don't get it." He said, what we used to do in the old days on Friday, they used to have free lunch at the union. And the only rule was you had to sit at the table with somebody who wasn't in your department. And that's how I got my first National Science Foundation grant. You're just thinking to yourself, I hate myself because I should have talked to somebody who didn't know anything about this at the beginning, right? I talked to all the domain experts and I violated my own rule. I didn't talk to somebody who didn't know about it. So I think if you engage them in a way that relates to their life, right, people are more than happy to help you out. But I love the comment. I love that because often from the mouth of babes, in my career, a lot of times that's where the solution was.
Yeah, that's really interesting to talk to people who don't know anything about the problem. So tons of questions. I think we have time for one more. So I'll give you this one from Ryan, and apologies to those of you whose questions I didn't get to. So Ryan says, I feel like many people don't give themselves time, mental space, or environments to be creative. What could managers or organizations do to enable their teams and people to be more naturally creative?
Yeah, boy. The three things that I've tried to lay out here. One was building the Innovatoriums with Hayworth was trying to create a space, a treehouse, like when I was a kid, where everybody was new and every week was new. And when you have a place, a sanctuary like that, and remember, it doesn't have to be something you build. It could be a coffee shop. It could be, a room in your basement. Maybe it already is. So there's something in your garage. Give yourself a place that doesn't have a task associated with it. It's what did Winnie the Pooh call it? His thinking place, right? Two, one of the big things I think about this is I will not plan meetings at certain times in the morning. And now I'm probably in a different situation. I have assistants and all this stuff, but they know not to schedule it. And the reason is it's free time. It's really not free time. For me, it's the time I work the hardest in the entire day because I'm a morning person. So from about 6 o'clock till about 11, I'm cooking on gas, right? And I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't want to get my flow. And it doesn't mean that I'm impolite. In fact, when I was at Domino's, one of the things we did at Domino's was you had to answer, you took questions from the field in the afternoon, and in the morning, you were not allowed to answer questions from the field. You had to work on your own stuff, right? And then a third thing is, the whole notion about making time. I think it's sort of like Lennon and McCartney. I think you need a creative friend. I think you need friends who ask you, how's that novel coming? How's that new recipe coming? What's going on with that? I write books now with my wife, Stanley, because that's kind of how it works. Jeff, have you thought at all about this? I'm like, oh, yeah. And that's kind of, I think, how you do that. So your thinking space, make sure that you organize your day to the best of your ability. Not everybody can do that. I understand that, but just to the best of your ability. And remember, a lot of famous novelists, I think like T.S. Eliot worked for the Bank of England, right? And became the most famous poet of the 20th century, sort of in his free time. And then finally have a creative friend.
Yeah, I love that. So a few ways that you can stay in touch with Jeff, as we mentioned, his book is coming very soon. I think it's September 29th, so you can pre-order it now. I would encourage you to connect with Jeff on LinkedIn. He is one of the original LinkedIn influencers, and he would love the chance to connect with you there. Visit the two websites, jeffdegraff.com and innovatrium.org, to find out more about Jeff and his work. And Jeff, I'm going to let you close out the hour with some type of parting inspiration and wisdom
Just
for our
say the
attendees
big
today.
thing is we're all creativizers. And the only way to get better at this, it comes from the old Walter Houston and Gabby Hayes, who'd ramble into John Wayne's camp and say, the cavalry ain't coming. The cavalry ain't coming. So I encourage all of you to find your creative muse, exhibit some self-authorizing behavior, and try it, right? Good luck to you.